My name is Natalie Hayes, I am 26 years old. Have you ever stood in the middle of your own kitchen while the man who once promised you forever looked you dead in the eye and delivered an ultimatum that turned every shared memory into a question mark? I have. The words still sit in my chest like cold stones. Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if any part of this already feels too familiar, hit subscribe and stay with me, because what happened next changed the shape of my entire life. It started on an ordinary Thursday evening in the elite suburban compound just outside Reno where my husband and I had lived for the past 2 years. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. I had just finished wiping down the counter when my husband walked in from the garage, still wearing the same charcoal dress shirt he'd left in that morning. He didn't kiss me. He didn't even set down his keys. He simply looked at me and said the words that cracked everything open. You either accept that Kayla is part of my professional life now, or we stop pretending this marriage is working. I stared at him. Kayla Simmons was the new senior associate at the commercial real estate firm where he worked. She had started 6 months earlier. I had met her twice at company dinners. She was polished, always smiling, always just a little too close when she laughed at his jokes. I had told myself I was being insecure. I had told myself successful people networked. I had told myself a lot of things. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. I'm not asking you to stop working with her. I'm asking why she has a key to our garage and why her perfume is on your coat 3 nights a week. He exhaled like I was exhausting him. This is exactly what I'm talking about. The constant suspicion. The little comments. I can't keep living with someone who treats every late meeting like a crime scene. I felt the familiar pressure behind my eyes, the one that always showed up when he used that calm, disappointed tone. I was patient. I had always been patient. I had learned early that raising my voice only made him shut down harder. So I kept my tone even. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm asking for honesty. That's all I've ever asked for. He shook his head slowly, the way someone does when they've already decided the conversation is over. Honesty works both ways, Natalie. You've been distant for months. You've been pulling away. Maybe this marriage already ended and we're both just late to the funeral. The words landed harder than any shout could have. I stood there with a dish towel still in my hands and watched him walk past me toward the bedroom. He didn't slam the door. He never needed to. The quiet was always worse. That night I slept on the couch. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself couples hit rough patches. I told myself the ultimatum was just stress talking. 2 days later the first small violation arrived. I opened our shared banking app while waiting for coffee and noticed a transfer I didn't recognize. $1,800 moved from our joint account to an unfamiliar business entity called Summit Collaborative LLC. The memo line simply read, "Consulting Retainer." I called the bank. They confirmed the transfer had been authorized with my husband's login and a notarized agreement scan that had been uploaded the previous week. My signature was not on it. When I asked him about it that evening, he didn't even look surprised. It's a short-term investment opportunity Kayla brought to the firm. High return, low risk. I didn't want to bother you with the details until it was locked in. You used money that belongs to both of us without telling me. He shrugged. I manage the investments. You manage the household. That's how we've always done it. The sentence was so smooth I almost believed it for a second. Almost. I spent the next week moving quietly. I didn't confront him again. I didn't raise my voice. I simply started saving every document, every late-night text notification that lit up his phone at 11:47 p.m., every time the garage door opened at 1:15 a.m. and the faint scent of someone else's perfume drifted into the hallway. I was patient. I was unyielding in the way that looks like silence from the outside. My older sister called on a Sunday afternoon. She lived across town with her husband and had always been the one who could read my voice in 3 syllables. Something's wrong, she said the moment I answered. You sound like you're holding your breath. I told her about the ultimatum. I told her about the transfer. I did not tell her how many times I had checked the notarized agreement scan, zooming in on the signature that was not mine. She was quiet for a long moment. Do you want me to come over? Not yet, I said. I need to understand what I'm looking at first. That same week my father asked me to stop by the house. He had been diagnosed with a progressive illness the previous winter and the doctors had recently shifted him to comfort care. He sat in his favorite chair by the window overlooking the backyard and waited until my mother left the room before he spoke. There's something I never told you, he said. His voice was thin but clear. When you were 12, your mother and I almost lost everything. A business partner embezzled from us. We survived, but only because I signed papers I shouldn't have signed. I buried the records. I thought they were gone forever. Someone has been asking questions about those old files. Someone who knows exactly where to look. He didn't say my husband's name. He didn't have to. The look he gave me was enough. I drove home that night with the windows down even though the desert air was cold. Childhood memories I had packed away years earlier started rising without permission. The way certain family meetings had gone silent when I walked into the room. The way my older sister had once whispered that some secrets were safer left buried. I had always believed those secrets belonged to the past. Suddenly they felt close enough to touch. 3 days after my father's admission, the anonymous tip arrived. It came as a plain white envelope taped to the front gate of the compound. No return address. Inside was a single printed page and a flash drive. The page contained a scanned copy of a second notarized agreement, this one dated 2 weeks earlier. My husband's signature sat next to Kayla Simmons's signature. The agreement authorized the quiet transfer of certain intellectual property rights belonging to a side project I had developed with a former coworker. Rights I had never agreed to sell. I sat on the edge of the guest room bed and read the document 3 times. My hand stayed steady. My breathing stayed even. Patient and unyielding, exactly the way I had always survived. That night when my husband came home, I did not show him the envelope. I simply watched him hang up his coat, the same coat that still carried the faint scent of someone else's perfume, and I realized the ultimatum he had given me in the kitchen had never been about choosing him or choosing peace. It had been about making sure I stayed quiet long enough for the paperwork to finish what the late nights had started. I placed the envelope in the bottom drawer of the desk we no longer shared and closed it softly. Outside the window, the lights of the compound glowed against the dark Nevada sky. Inside the house, the silence stretched between us like a living thing. I still had not raised my voice. But something inside me had already begun to harden into the shape of a decision I was not yet ready to name. The decision I had not yet named stayed with me through the long night that followed. By morning I understood I could no longer wait for the truth to arrive on its own. I drove across town the next afternoon and sat with my father while my mother ran errands. His voice was weaker than it had been only days earlier, but the clarity in his eyes had not faded. He asked me to close the bedroom door before he spoke again. "Those old files I mentioned," he said, each word measured. "The ones from when you were a child. Someone requested certified copies last month. The request came through a commercial real estate firm here in Reno. The same firm where your husband works." I felt the room tilt. Did they use my name? No. They used a business entity. Summit Collaborative LLC. The same name that appeared on the transfer from your joint account. I left his house with the flash drive from the anonymous envelope still in my purse and a new weight settling behind my ribs. Childhood memories I had spent years locking away began to surface without invitation. I remembered being 12 years old and overhearing my parents argue in the kitchen about a partner who had vanished with money that was supposed to secure our future. I remembered the way my older sister had pulled me into her room and told me never to ask about the missing papers. I had obeyed. I had always been the patient one. That evening my husband came home later than usual. He walked into the living room where I sat with my laptop open and spoke as if nothing had shifted between us. "Kayla and I are finalizing a side agreement tomorrow," he said. "It could bring in serious returns. I need you to stop questioning every move I make. It's starting to affect my focus at the office." I looked up at him. "You transferred money that belonged to both of us without telling me. You signed documents that include rights I never agreed to release. That is not a question. That is a fact." He set his keys down harder than necessary. "You're rewriting history again. You've always done this when you feel insecure. You take small details and turn them into proof that I'm the villain. I'm tired of defending myself against ghosts." The gaslighting was so practiced it almost sounded reasonable. I felt the familiar urge to smooth things over, to protect the peace we used to have. Instead, I stayed silent and watched him walk toward the bedroom. The door closed with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. The following morning I contacted Carl Donovan, a private investigator whose name I had found through a quiet recommendation from a former coworker. We met at a coffee shop on the edge of the city where no one from the firm was likely to appear. I handed him the notarized agreement scans and the flash drive. He listened without interrupting while I explained the transfers, the late nights, the perfume, and the connection to my father's old files. "I'll dig into Summit Collaborative and the signature chain," he said. "If the documents were notarized under false pretenses, there will be a paper trail. Give me a few days." I left the meeting feeling both lighter and more exposed. That same afternoon, my neighbor Tina Morales stopped me at the compound gate while I was checking the mail. She glanced toward our house before speaking in a low voice. "I've seen the same silver sedan parked near your garage 3 times this week after midnight," she said. "A woman with dark hair gets out, stays less than 10 minutes, and leaves." I didn't want to assume, but it didn't feel right. I thanked her and walked back inside with my pulse loud in my ears. The confirmation from someone outside the marriage made the deception harder to dismiss as insecurity. 2 nights later, my husband issued a new private demand. We were standing in the kitchen again, the same place where the first ultimatum had been delivered. He poured a glass of water and spoke without looking at me. "I need you to sign a limited power of attorney for the investment accounts. Kayla's attorney drafted it. It's temporary. Just until the Summit project closes. If you refuse, I'm going to have to reconsider whether this marriage can continue under the current level of distress." The words were calm. The threat inside them was not. I felt the old childhood training rise up, the training that said keep the peace, absorb the pressure, do not make the situation worse. For a long moment I almost reached for the pen. Then I remembered the scanned agreement that already carried a signature that was not mine. "I won't sign anything I haven't had independently reviewed," I said. His jaw tightened. "Then you're choosing the hard way. Don't act surprised when the consequences arrive." He left the room. I stood alone with the unsigned document on the counter and the knowledge that the private coercion had just crossed into irreversible territory. The next morning Carl Donovan called. His voice was steady but urgent. "The notarized agreement transferring your intellectual property rights was filed with a notary who has since reported the commission stolen. The notary stamp on that document does not match any active record for the date listed. Someone created a fraudulent scan and used it to move the rights into Summit Collaborative. Your husband's firm is listed as the managing entity. Kayla Simmons is listed as the primary contact." I sat down hard on the edge of the bed. The theft was no longer a suspicion. It was documented. That afternoon my older sister arrived unannounced. She took one look at my face and sat beside me on the couch without asking questions. I told her everything, the transfers, the fraudulent notarization, the connection to our father's old files, the ultimatum that had just been repeated with higher stakes. She was quiet for a long time. "He's using the same pattern Dad warned us about when we were kids," she said finally. "Find the weak point, isolate the person who notices, then move the assets before anyone can stop it. You were always the one who noticed. That's why the pressure is on you." Her words pulled another childhood memory free. I remembered sitting on the back steps at 12 years old while my parents argued about trust and signatures and the cost of looking the other way. I had promised myself then that I would never sign anything I did not understand. I had broken that promise in small ways over the years of my marriage. I would not break it again. Later that night my sister-in-law Michelle called. Her voice was careful, almost rehearsed. "Brandon asked me to check on you," she said. "He's worried you're spiraling. He said the stress of your father's illness is making you see problems that aren't there. Maybe you should talk to someone. A professional." I recognized the tactic immediately. Isolate. Reframe. Make the person who asks questions look unstable. I thanked her politely and ended the call. The circle of people who still believed me was shrinking by the hour. I spent the next day gathering every document I could find: bank statements, the original intellectual property registration, the fraudulent notarized scan, the notes from Carl Donovan. I placed them in a single folder and locked it in the trunk of my car. Then I drove to the hospital to sit with my father again. He was awake. When I told him what Carl had discovered, he closed his eyes for a long moment. "I failed to protect those records the first time," he said. "Do not make the same mistake I did. Whatever you decide, decide it with your eyes open." I left the hospital as the sun dropped. Behind the mountains. My phone buzzed with a text from my husband. "I'm staying at the office tonight. Kayla and I have paperwork to finish. Sign the power of attorney by tomorrow or I'll assume you've made your choice." The message was timestamped 8:47 p.m. The deadline was less than 24 hours away. I sat in the driveway of the elite suburban compound we still shared and stared at the dark windows of the house. Inside those walls the life I had built was being quietly dismantled, one notarized page at a time. Outside, the desert wind moved through the landscaping with a sound that felt almost like a warning. I opened the folder on the passenger seat and looked at the fraudulent agreement one more time. The signature that was not mine stared back at me. Tomorrow the private coercion would force an irreversible consequence. I still did not know which consequence I would choose. But I knew I would no longer pretend the choice belonged to anyone else. The morning of the deadline arrived with the same dry desert light that had watched every quiet erosion of the life I thought I had built. I sat at the kitchen table with the folder of documents open in front of me and waited for my husband to come downstairs. When he did, he was already dressed for the office, phone in hand. The expression on his face settled into the calm certainty of someone who expected compliance. "I need the signed power of attorney before I leave," he said. "Kayla's attorney is waiting on the filing." I slid the fraudulent notarized agreement across the table instead. The one that had moved my intellectual property rights without my knowledge. The one Carl Donovan had confirmed was stamped with a stolen notary commission. "This is what you actually need to explain," I said. My voice stayed level. "Not a temporary form. This." He glanced at the page, then at me, and the mask of patience slipped just enough for something colder to show through. "You're still chasing shadows." That document was a standard assignment for the Summit project. "You were informed." I was not. "And the notary whose stamp appears on it has already reported the commission stolen." Carl Donovan verified the record. "Yesterday." For the first time his expression flickered. Then he recovered, voice dropping into the familiar register of disappointed concern. "You hired a private investigator behind my back. Do you hear how that sounds? Your father's illness is destroying your ability to think clearly. You're turning ordinary business into a conspiracy so you don't have to face how unhappy you've become in this marriage." The gaslighting landed with practiced precision. I felt the old childhood instinct rise, the one that said absorb the blame, keep the household steady, do not force a scene. I pushed it down. "I'm not signing anything," I said. "And I'm taking the original registration documents for my work to an independent attorney today." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he spoke the words that made the private coercion irreversible. "If you walk out that door with those files, I will treat it as an act of marital sabotage." The joint accounts will be frozen pending review. The house is titled in a way that protects the primary earner. You will leave with whatever fits in your car and the knowledge that you chose destruction over partnership. I stood up. My hands were steady. Then I choose the destruction of the lie. I left the house with the folder and the clothes I could pack in 20 minutes. I did not look back at the elite suburban compound that had once felt like proof of a shared future. By afternoon I sat in the small office of Laura Bennett, an attorney whose name Carl Donovan had given me. She reviewed every page in silence, then looked up with the careful expression of someone delivering news that could not be softened. The fraudulent assignment already transferred the rights into Summit Collaborative, she said. Because the notary stamp was compromised after the fact, challenging it will take months and significant cost. In the meantime, the entity controls the asset. Your husband and Kayla Simmons appear as managing members. Even if you eventually prevail, the practical value may already be diluted or redirected. The family fortune that had been quietly building through my side work was already moving beyond my reach. The paperwork had done what late nights and ultimatums could not finish alone. That evening I returned to my parents' house. My father was weaker. When I told him what the attorney had confirmed, he closed his eyes and spoke the final piece of the childhood secret he had carried for years. The partner who embezzled from us when you were 12 used the same structure, he said. Create an entity, move the rights under the cover of ordinary business, isolate the person who notices. I signed papers I did not fully understand because I wanted to believe the people closest to me would not use trust as a weapon. I have watched your husband do the same thing with different language. I am sorry I did not see it sooner. The admission settled over the room like dust. My older sister sat beside me and held my hand without speaking. There was nothing left to explain. In the days that followed, the consequences arrived exactly as my husband had promised. The joint accounts were restricted. Friends I had shared dinners with for years stopped answering calls after my sister-in-law Michelle began telling people I had become unstable under the strain of my father's illness. Tina Morales, the neighbor who had once warned me about the silver sedan, sent a brief message saying she preferred not to get involved in marital disputes. Even Sofia Rivera, a high school friend who had always claimed fierce loyalty, asked me to stop contacting her because the situation had become too complicated. Close friendships erased themselves with quiet efficiency. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of Reno with what little I had managed to keep. Carl Donovan continued gathering records, but the legal process moved at the speed of paperwork and money I no longer controlled. Kayla Simmons remained at the firm. My husband remained in the house. The Summit entity continued operating. I visited my father every day until the morning he no longer opened his eyes. At the quiet service my husband did not attend. My mother stood beside me with the stunned expression of someone still trying to reconcile the man she had raised a daughter with and the man who had used that daughter's trust as currency. Weeks later, Laura Bennett called with a final update. A quiet redirection of remaining assets linked to the old family records had been completed through a series of filings I had never been shown. The fortune that might have offered leverage was gone. The antagonist remained untouched. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the apartment and felt the full weight of the choice I had made. I had refused to sign. I had refused to pretend. I had chosen the truth over the performance of a marriage that had already ended in everything but name. The cost was everything familiar. There was no courtroom victory. There was no public reckoning that restored what had been taken. There was only the fierce quiet independence of a woman who finally understood that actions, not promises, prove real loyalty. Peace over pretense had required me to walk away from the life that pretenses had built. I still wake some nights expecting the sound of the garage door and the faint scent of someone else's perfume. The tension has never fully resolved. It lives in the space where trust used to be. Thank you for listening to my story. What's your breaking point? The moment you stop explaining and start protecting the only person who will still be standing when the paperwork is finished?